Hello, today we're going to be talking about how parasites make us sick. If we haven't met yet, my name is Pam Bartha. I am the author of Become a Wellness Champion and the founder of Live Disease Free. This is a really important topic because understanding how parasites make us sick is really what helped myself to recover from multiple sclerosis 29 years ago. And it also helps the wellness champions recover also. So hopefully you guys are starting to join now. So this is a really large topic. Today we're going to just touch on a few things, and then in future events I'm going to be talking in more detail about how parasites make us sick. But today it's going to give you a really great overview so you can understand how broad and range parasites can affect our health. So thank you so much for the love, and please type in your questions in the question box. I want to say hello to Susan and Troy and Danielle, Stephanie, Rick, Jill, hello, and please thumbs up if I say something that you can relate to, or send the hearts. I love the hearts. And also share this video with people that you know that are suffering with disease symptoms and they're looking for answers, because today it really helps you to see the scope of how parasites can make us sick. So first of all, I want to share with you that number one, we know, and this is really well understood in science, and unfortunately it's not getting into our standard of care, but in science they know that there are at least 17 different ways that infections can cause inflammation and also immune dysfunction. And today we're talking about specific infections, which would be parasites. And what are parasites? So parasites are not always worms. They could be fungi or fungus, so things like candida or aspergillus. You may have heard of different types of fungal infections. They could be worms, huge worms, small, tiny little worms that we can't see. They could also be single-celled parasites and bacteria. So there's lots of different microbes that live off of the host, and that would be us, or they come in through other different microbes. We'll talk about that also, but they live off of us, and we don't end up with this high fever. You know, like when you go to your doctor and you have a really sore throat and you've got redness and swelling and a big temperature, right? And the doctor looks at your throat and will do a culture and they can possibly pick up a bacterial infection. So that would be an acute infection. Today we're going to talk about chronic parasitic infections that are ongoing and how that can affect us in so many different ways and how they make us sick. So we're going to talk about worms, yes, and parasites, but also little tiny parasites like Babesia, which is a single cell parasite that can get in our red blood cell, and how that would affect us. And also like different types of fungi, bacteria, etc. So getting back to the inflammation and immune dysfunction. So this is how these microbes make us sick. These are a couple of ways. We'll talk about other ways also. So as far as the inflammation, we know that whenever somebody is suffering with chronic disease, inflammation, or even just disease, inflammation is always present. That's always the biggest sign of chronic disease. We have inflammation. A lot of practitioners, they don't know what is causing the inflammation, and so a lot of times we'll use immunosuppressive drugs. But we also know that whenever we have an infection, there is a lot of inflammation involved. And the progressive healthcare providers, they understand that when we have inflammation in the body, inflammation in the body associated with chronic disease, that is caused by infection. So how do these microbes cause inflammation in the body? Well, they have many different ways. Number one is they can produce tons of chemicals. So in my masterclass training, and I'll talk about more about that later, but in my masterclass training, I talk about how, let's just talk about candida. That's just one type of fungus that can make us sick if it is present in high numbers in our body. Well, when we have candida in the body, we can end up with different types of chemicals produced. We can have things like formaldehyde produced. We can have different neurotoxins like acetaldehyde. That is the hangover chemical, the one that makes us feel like we were hit by a truck. So these types of chemicals can be produced, many others. They estimate about over 70 different toxins produced by candida. So if we are in balance, if we've got a strong, healthy ecosystem, our natural defense, the good microbes. We've never been on antibiotics, and that is pretty rare these days. But let's say you're really imbalanced and you just had a little bit of candida sprinkled throughout especially your digestive tract. It's not a problem because it's not going to be producing a lot of chemicals, so you're not going to have a lot of inflammation. But when you start having high amounts of, like being on antibiotics, overuse of antibiotics, maybe too many carbs in our diet to feed the problem, other medications, etc., and circumstances in our life, and we end up with high levels of candida or others we'll talk about, then they're producing too many poisons. We know that worms, and other parasites, they can produce ammonia, and with a lot of ammonia that really affects our brain. They can also produce different types of chemicals that are associated with, they're kind of like morphine type substances and amphetamines. So you can imagine if you have high amounts of ammonia or amphetamines or morphine type substances, it can really mess with your brain. This is where people get rage and they get mood disorders. And then this is also linked with different psychoses, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. It's so interesting that 200 years ago, this French physician, Dr. Philippe Pinel, he knew already that, and I'm just going to read his quote because it's so profound. This was 200 years ago. What he said is, the primary seat of insanity generally is in the region of the stomach and the intestines. So that's Philippe Pinel, P-I-N-E-L, 1807. The primary seat of insanity generally is in the region of the stomach and intestines. That is huge. What an insight that long ago. And unfortunately, we are not treating infections when we have mental, or not even looking, I should say. Yes, there can be different types of issues that are involved with different types of disease, but we're not even looking at infections as to being a big part of different types of mental health issues, and it really is. So the inflammation that is caused by these infections. We talked about certain chemicals, right? And we just touched on them. And then also, we know that the inflammation is also caused by the direct assaults from these infections themselves. So with multiple sclerosis, Dr. Alan McDonald has discovered in 2014, in every sample that he tested of somebody or people that have died of MS, he found that in the central nervous system, there were many, many small parasitic worms. And he said just them swimming around and injuring tissue would cause inflammation for sure. And we see in research, and I've been sharing last week, some case studies where they're finding worms in bone marrow in people that have back issues. So you can imagine that if you have these little worms in certain areas, and then we know even in our intestines, they will attach to the intestinal wall. So wherever these parasites can cause injury to our tissue, that will also cause inflammation. So that's really important. So whether it's a direct assault on our tissue or whether it's the chemicals that are produced by these infections, there's tons and tons of evidence. And this has been known for a very long time. It's just that this is not the approach that our standard of care is going towards these days, unfortunately. So also, how can these infections make us sick? We know that, for example, with worms and probably other parasites too, they can produce a lot of, there's an increase in production of histamines. And when you have high levels, this is what they've seen in studies, is when you have high levels of histamines, we get all those terrible allergy symptoms. But also, what's really awful is that a high level of histamine in studies have shown that there's actually a downregulation in the production of immune cells that actually go after the parasites. So the eosinophils are downregulated when there's high histamine. So these worms can produce histamines, right? Or increase the level of histamines in the body. And then we end up having, if it becomes quite an infestation, we end up having a decrease in the immune cells that fight the worms, and that perpetuates the infestation of the parasite. So then we have more worms, and then we, etc. It just becomes a downward spiral. So we have to understand these things, and these are just a very few things that are affecting us. So with respect to the parasites, they also cause leaky gut. So many of you have heard, like, when we're sick, when we have food sensitivities and we have stomach issues, we end up with leaky gut. And yes, we do know that things like glyphosate can cause leaky gut, but when we have dysbiosis, when we're really out of balance and we have different types of parasites, whether they're single cell or whether they're 2-foot worms, etc., they are damaging the intestinal integrity, the lining of the GI tract. So we end up with leaky gut, and then we have different substances that are crossing from our intestines into our blood, which shouldn't, and that gets our immune system all upset and excited. So that is a big deal, the leaky gut. It's really, really huge as far as making us feel sick and causing huge immune reactions. So with the inflammation, we've talked lots about inflammation. So now let's talk about immune dysfunction. So remember, the science has known for many years that these infections cause inflammation. And think about inflammation as being the war zone, right? The war zone of where your immune system is fighting infection. Sometimes the war gets out of hand, and that is the case. So we talked about inflammation, about it's present in chronic disease and how these infections cause inflammation. And now we're going to talk about immune dysfunction, because there's so many ways that these infections, parasites, can cause immune dysfunction. One of the ways is that it actually can cause a down-regulation of our immune system. So it suppresses our immune system. That is a really big deal, because we need our immune system to fight these infections. So just one example, and like I said, this is a huge topic, and I may chunk it down, like talk one time solely about immune dysfunction, another time solely about inflammation, but just to give you just a taste of it. So with respect to immune dysfunction, Candida can produce antibodies, they can produce enzymes which eat our antibodies, right? It's like a Pac-Man, and it's eating our antibodies, and we need our antibodies for creating immune responses and for dealing with infections and parasitic infections. And so it will actually eat antibodies, which directly suppresses our immune system, and then we're more susceptible to other infections. So that is one way. Another way that it can suppress the immune system is through, let me just check over here. We know that they can produce certain chemicals that cause our immune system to be basically blind. So our immune cells can be sitting right in front of certain infected cells, or it can be also, whether it's an infected cell or whether it's the infection itself, and the immune cells just don't deal with the infection. It can even be that our immune cells are sitting in front of cancer cells and it doesn't recognize the cancer. So there are multiple ways, but this is one way that it actually makes the immune system blind to it. So we talked about down-regulating the immune system, but it can also cause an upregulation of the immune system. So parasites can cause our immune system to overreact, right? And this is where they talk about autoimmunity. It's like your immune system has gone haywire, it's gone awry, we've got to shut it down, we've got to suppress it. No, why don't we treat the parasites that are causing the symptoms? So we know that with chronic disease and inflammation and immune dysfunction, sometimes we get a really strong release of cytokines, which are little molecules involved with our immune response. And these are very powerful little molecules, and they cause huge immune responses. And so they call it a cytokine cascade. And when we have these cytokine cascades, we get all kinds of different symptoms. We can get fatigue, and we can get foggy head, and we can get all the symptoms that we're dealing with, flu-like symptoms, etc. Very often, it's not the microbes, the parasites that are actually making us feel sick. It's our immune response. It's kind of like an overreaction to the war, right? And that's what's causing a lot of our symptoms. So whether it is an upregulation or a downregulation, the kind of symptoms that we're seeing here are, fatigue and insomnia and depression and anxiety. And we can end up with things like spasticity and poor balance, instability. Like maybe it's feeling unstable for a while, and then balance issues and dizziness, and it just can vision issues, and it goes on and on and on. It really depends on which parasites you have, where they're located in the body, because we know that a lot of them will start off in the gut, but as we become more infested over time, they move into different parts of the body. So for example, we could have some parasites living, so it could be bacterial, it could be fungal, living in our in the esophagus, for example, right? And they call that GERD, where we have a hard time swallowing. And I'm talking about this because some of the students I work with as the wellness champions, they have an issue with this. So a lot of times with GERD, they'll find that they have heartburn, so they have ulcers maybe at the bottom of the esophagus, which is infection, right? And that's inflammation. And so then we end up getting a rough esophagus, and I shouldn't have touched the mic. So we end up getting the lining of the esophagus is rough, and we have inflammation. Whenever you hear about inflammation, think about infection and parasites, right? So what we do in our standard of care is like, oh, we've got, acid. So we were maybe heartburn, etc. So what we'll do is we'll decrease the acid. We will use acid blocker medication, when instead we should be treating the infection. And actually most people are low in acid. So when you correct it, then you can swallow again. So this can affect our voice. This can affect our swallowing ability. Things like babesia is another type of parasite that we can, so this is a tiny little single cell parasite that we could have that will infect our red blood cells. And with that, we end up with chills and fevers and body aches and headaches and air hunger. Like if you're walking up a hill or just walking quickly and you have this unusual, like difficult time catching your breath, that is air hunger. And that would be because your red blood cells are being infected by babesia. There's a lot of different symptoms, and that is one of the microbes that travels together with Lyme disease. How complicated is this? Well, Dr. Alan McDonald has discovered that those tiny little nematode worms that get into the central nervous system of multiple sclerosis, they actually carry Borrelia, which is Lyme disease. So they're actually bringing in other infections. And so this is how we have to understand that these worms, the big ones might not be making us sick. And my students pass a lot of large worms, somewhere between 3 to 4 inches up to a foot to 2 feet long and over 2 feet long. So the biggest worms, I don't believe that they are causing the severe neurological symptoms associated with multiple sclerosis or with other neurodegenerative diseases. But think about it. They carry their own microbes, and they are depositing their waste in us, and they're creating a toxic environment. And so just like those little nematodes that are crossing the central nerve, crossing the blood-brain barrier, getting into the central nervous system, and they are depositing Lyme disease into our central nervous system. All right, and then we end up with Lyme disease in our central nervous system, plus the worms, plus their waste, right? And so we have this horrible, horrible storm, a perfect storm, and that's just what we've discovered, right? And it's the mosquitoes that give us the little worms that, so it's not just ticks that bring the Lyme in, but it's mosquitoes that can bring us the worms that we're infected with. And if our immune system is too suppressed, we're dealing with too much inflammation and immune dysfunction mostly from what's growing in our gut, then we end up being susceptible to these different microbes living in different parts of the body. We see in our students too that people that have a lot of back pain, they're actually finding little worms in bone marrow. And when I look at all these studies, they're saying, oh no, those worms present in the bone marrow, that's just incidental, it's accident, we just found them there. They're just hanging out. I don't think so. I'm not saying that the worms are the 100% cause of all chronic disease, but I'm saying they shouldn't be there, and they probably are part of the problem, maybe a bigger part of the problem than we realize. So the key is to understand that they're finding in the research, they're finding little parasitic worms. When they're pulling liquid out of cysts, they find the worms. When they're taking in a liquid or whatever they're taking out of the hard masses, like whether they're looking for cancer and tumors, etc., and they're finding worms there. And in thyroid, they're finding worms. So not all the time, but they are finding them. And I don't know about all the time, but what I'm saying is that this is in the scientific studies. So this is something that is so incredibly overlooked. So we talked about a lot of things. We talked about how they cause inflammation, right? And that's always associated with chronic disease. We talked about how they cause immune dysfunction. So either we end up with this suppressed immune system, or we end up with this overreactive immune system. We talked about how they produce and they cause the production of histamines, which actually makes these infections stronger in time, and it makes our immune system weaker. And we talked about leaky gut. So these are just 4 ways that parasites can make us sick. And it affects every single part of our body. We know that they're getting into our eyes, and some of you may have noticed the floaters, etc. It can be fungus, it can be Lyme, it can be little parasitic worms. You name it, you have symptoms, you have to start thinking infections. And what I'm seeing is that parasites are most often the biggest culprit. And the big awakening about learning how these large parasitic worms actually are perpetuating the problem is such a huge, huge insight. Because if you just focus on treating Lyme disease, if you just focus on treating Candida, but you're infested with parasites, with worms, that's a different type, you're not going to clear the Lyme, you're not going to clear the viruses, you're not going to clear the fungi. And that is so important to understand this. So the parasites are largely overlooked in our standard of care, really unfortunate. But you, as you're learning about this, you have to become the director of your health. You have to learn these simple, important strategies of how to correct your microbiome, how to correct and build up your natural defense. Knock back the parasites, bring back the good microbes, because that is so important for longevity. And isn't it crazy that over 200 years ago, this wonderful physician knew already, and I'm sure he wasn't the only one. So type in your questions if you have any last questions for me. But what I'd like to talk about just for a minute or two is, like, why are we not treating parasites? Why is this so difficult? Those of us that are suffering with chronic disease, we have access to the most expensive drugs. They're so incredibly strong, and they are very, very toxic. None of them are treating the cause because they don't know what the cause is. It is infection, but they don't know what the cause is. So the key is we have to start to challenge this. And that's what the wellness champions are doing, is that they're taking charge of their health. They're learning how to be the director of their health. They're taking back their life. And we've got lots of testimonies and successes that I share on my masterclass training. And actually, I share them usually. I didn't pull them together for this week, but I definitely share them on others. So I'm going to go and check to see if you guys have any questions for me. All right, let me see. Here we go. Hi, Becca. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Tiffany. And okay, are all parasites visible on the stool? No, they're not. And that is a really big thing. Only the larger worms are visible, and we do special enemas that we're actually releasing them, and we can see them. And that's why, like, if you're interested in this, any of you interested in this, I have a 5 or 6 part series on multiple sclerosis and infections. One of them is MS and parasitic worms. I've got a few pictures there. I think I have to redo that soon because we've got about 70 pictures of parasitic worms. So we can see the big ones, but we can't see the tiny, tiny little ones. So there are so many single-celled protozoa and tiny little worms, thread worms, etc., that we can't see. You could probably see a thread worm, but if it's in your stool, you can't. And it really takes a holistic approach to treating them, unfortunately. So you can't see all the parasites. You can only see the larger worms in the stool if you inspect it and if you're treating them really well. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Gina. Hi, Janelle. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Caroline. Does ozone therapy kill worms? That's a really great question. Yes, if ozone touches the worm, it will kill it for sure. But the problem is that I have a machine and I love it. But when I do rectal ozone treatments, or I have in the past, then we know that the catheter, I can't remember, I think it's like about 6 inches long, and you can get a larger one. I have a longer one too, but it's only going to reach part of your large intestines. And you're only doing, like the students are doing according to what their healthcare provider recommends, but somewhere between 30 seconds to a minute type thing. And so that's not a lot of ozone. And so it's not going to get rid of all of the parasites in your large intestines, because your large intestine would be 5 feet long approximately. And then you also have at least, I think it's at least 20 or 30, 20 some feet. So you're looking at about 30 feet of intestines. And so the ozone is not going to treat your small intestine for sure. It's only going to treat part of your large intestine. So the students that I work with chronic disease, it is shocking how infested they are with even large worms. And it's also the small worms, because we're seeing that as we're treating them, things like spasticity goes away, right? And we don't know exactly, we have a pretty good hunch of what type of parasites are causing the spasticity, et cetera. But the problem is there are different microbes that can cause similar neurological symptoms. And we don't really care exactly what it is at this point. People just want to get well. So as they're treating parasites, the spasticity is going away. Balance comes back. And people can actually, which I never promise, but it's just crazy, but as far as if they've had a clenched hand for, let's say, years, then all of a sudden it opens, or they can start moving a couple of fingers. So that's the exciting thing, is that these horrible, horrible symptoms that we thought are permanent, they're not always permanent. There are people that are coming out of wheelchairs, they are getting rid of their walkers, they're getting rid of their canes. We have people in our class right now in the academy that are treating these infections. And unfortunately, it's not enough just to go into the health food store and just get a herbal blend. Yes, if you're a healthy person and you just have a little bit of maybe constipation or gas or bloating, go ahead and use the herbs. It may help you a bit, but we're finding that, number one, the herbs, the blends that we've used, and there's many different ones we've used, they're not strong enough to get the big parasites. They're not strong enough to go into our body, whether we have parasites in our blood, whether they've moved into the central nervous system, it's not enough. And actually, parasites are really linked with cancer also, single cell parasites. So it's not just fungus, and fungus is a type of parasite, but it's kind of different than bacteria or single cell parasites, etc. So ozone is great. And if you do, let's say, working with a practitioner and you do IV or you do the 10 pass, then you will definitely clear some out of different smaller parasites out of your blood. But the problem is it's not going to reach your intestines, where the vast majority of them are hanging out, and it's not going to reach the central nervous system. So this is where you just have to really see, like, is it cost effective? Because it can get to be quite costly if you're doing ozone treatments as far as the 10 pass. Hi, Ronnie. Hi, Tiffany. Hi, Ashley. What kind of parasite cleanse should we do, and what do you recommend? And that's a really tough one, Ashley, because if you have chronic disease, you have to work with someone who understands how to treat. This is something we've been learning. So we found that the antiparasitic drugs, specific ones, are much better tolerated, and they're much more effective. You can recover quicker. And with chronic disease, if we just use the herbs, we found that a lot of students just couldn't move forward. And a lot of times they were quite sensitive to the herbs, and they'd have to go so incredibly slowly. And another thing to say is that the drugs are not perfect, and that's why we layer things. We use oxidizing agents, we use the drugs, and we use herbs, all of them together. And I can't recommend one specific one, Ashley, because I don't know you at all. And there are different types of parasitic drugs. Some of them will treat worms, and some of them will treat protozoa. And so they're all, and it depends which infections you have, right? It depends, do you have babesia? Do you have big worms? Do you have tiny little nematodes? Where are they located? And that's why you really have to work with someone. It is my mission to collaborate with practitioners, and I'm actually going to an amazing workshop next week to study under one of the hero doctors that really understands parasites well. And so I'll be sharing lots of insights with you, but our goal is to really get the word out and really bring change and to start treating the cause, because the exciting thing is people are getting their life back, and that is priceless, right? But you have to work with someone. So you can try to find a practitioner that understands how to treat the parasites, kind of like how I've been talking, and watch my videos. So if you're somebody who's never met me before, I just wanted to share too that I was diagnosed with MS 29 years ago. This is why I'm so passionate about this, because when you get your life back, there's nothing more rewarding than helping other people get their life back, because MS is brutal. It is an absolute brutal disease, like Parkinson's and ALS and all these neurologic and cancer. They're all brutal diseases. And so I have been able to live MS free for the past 29 years because I learned about this back then. I didn't learn about it perfectly, but I caught it right away. And I have been managing my microbes ever since. So if this is the first time you've ever met me, make sure that you watch my masterclass training. I've got a ton of videos on YouTube and on Facebook, and that is Live Disease Free. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you hear about future trainings. And if you're ready, if you're like, Pam, I've been searching for so many things, I've tried so many things, I understand what you're talking about, then reach out to us. After you watch the masterclass training, you'll have an opportunity to chat with me and get started right away. And you can join the Academy, you can become a wellness champion, you can start treating infections. That's what we do in the Academy. Otherwise, I'm gonna go back to your questions here. So unfortunately, Ashley, there are probably 7 or 8 drugs that are commonly used, and it really depends on which types of parasites you have. And right now it's difficult because you can have a stool test done and it's not going to show up. If you've got certain parasites in your central nervous system or in your blood, it's not going to show up on the stool test. And actually with the stool test, they really don't look for a lot of different parasites that could be involved. So they're missed. So really we are working with practitioners that can do some type of energy testing, and that gives us some idea. And we're also looking at health history and symptoms, etc. So that is how we are coming to the conclusion of what to use for treating them. But you can't just, there is not just one antiparasitic drug that will take care of all the different types of parasites, or all the different types of parasites that could be causing your symptoms. I wish it wasn't that complicated, but it is. Hi, Mariana. Hi, Jill. Hi, Denise. Hi, Marie. Hi, Misty. You shared this with your Facebook group, scleroderma. It's exactly the same. It is infections, different ones than MS. So remember that when we become infected, and we're talking about not acute, we're talking about chronic infections, whatever the microbes are, some of them like to live in our joints, some of them like to live in our eyes, some of them like to move into the central nervous system, right? And so I've talked lots about how they're finding different microbes, in different parts of the body. And so depending on the types of microbes we have and the location of where they set up camp in our body, and depending on which toxins they produce, the type of inflammation they're causing, we get a disease label, and then we have to go on immune suppressive drugs. So instead of treating the cause, we are suppressing the immune system, and then we end up still becoming sicker and sicker over time, and we don't have our life back. Thank you so much, Misty, for sharing. You are a champion. Hi, Pam. Good subject. It is true. It's shocking when I look at these studies and they're finding all these parasites located in different parts of the body, and they're just saying, oh, that's accidental, it's incidental, it has nothing to do with the cyst, it has nothing to do with the tumor, it has nothing to do with the thyroid issue that the person's dealing with, or the back problems they're dealing with. Actually, in one of the studies that I shared, I think it was last week on the Facebook Live, that I did talk about how they did give the one person that had back issues, back pain, they did test for antibodies, and they found that this person had antibodies against, I believe it was the cat or dog tapeworm, or roundworm. And so they ended up putting this person on a medication and had significant improvement. That is somebody who has worms in their bone marrow, right? And so the worms should not be there, for sure. It's really important to talk about this topic too, because I'm seeing that they're trying to sell us on, that they should infect us with worms like the pig roundworm, which will modulate our immune response. And it's like, our immune system is pretty intelligent. If we just support it with dealing with the infections, we don't need to modulate it. Let it go back to working the way it's supposed to. I don't want a pig roundworm inside of me. When you look at the studies, and that's the thing, is they don't talk about the entire study. When they're putting these worms in us, those people that were in the study, they have terrible gut issues. They can only have them for a while, and then they take them out, and hopefully they can get them all out of you, right? Or maybe you'll end up with little immature forms that break out of the gut and move into different parts of the body and end up in your central nervous system, and then you have other problems. It's insanity to me. It's absolute insanity. Why? Because I have passed tons of worms. I feel so much better for it. My students have passed tons of worms. They become symptom-free, and we don't need to infect ourselves with worms. Do you guys agree or not? I think it's crazy. So the problem is too, when they give us this pig roundworm, then what happens is that while we're having this worm inside of our intestines, then it is kind of trying to suppress our immune system, producing certain chemicals. But once we take it out, then we have the inflammation again, right? So we don't want to live with these worms inside of us. I'm assuming that's true. Yes, thank you. I see you guys agree with that. Hi, Roberta. Hi, Naji. Hi, Marette. Hi, Debbie. Tiffany. See if there's any. Hi, Michael. I'm glad you're here too. And hi, Anthony. Kim. Dan. Alexander. Hello. Do you guys have any more questions for me? I know that this is a lot of science that I talk, but it's really important that you understand why you're having all these symptoms. It's not a mystery. It's not just you have inflammation. The inflammation is caused by something. It is caused by infections. And what we have discovered, thanks for all the love, what we have discovered is that it is largely a parasitic infestation. And depending on where it's living and the poisons it's producing and the damage it's doing to your tissue, that is the type of parasite. So I'm hoping that we are going to attract more and more attention to different practitioners, because they are really excited about this, but they don't have good tests. They haven't been trained in this. And so that is a problem, but it is changing. It is coming along. Thanks to hero doctors. Rochelle, can't diatomaceous earth kill parasites? So diatomaceous earth definitely can help, for sure. You can only take it for so long, but it is not going to get all the parasites. So for example, if you have parasites in your blood, if you have them in your gallbladder, if you have them in your liver, so cysts in different parts of your body are very often, they're for sure infection and very often parasites. If they're in your central nervous system, no. If you're a really healthy person and you want to do like herbs and diatomaceous earth, absolutely. But if you have chronic disease, you'll find that you have to be really careful too when you're using diatomaceous earth, because if you use too much, you can feel like a strong Herxheimer reaction and you can't take it for long. It can be helpful. On its own, it's not going to be enough for sure. And then remember, Rochelle, that there are eggs and there are biofilms, and I know that it is a bit of a biofilm buster too. So it is something that we can use in conjunction, absolutely. But we're finding, that's something we've used for a long time. And for people that have chronic disease, it's just not enough on its own. Great question though. Hi, Jose. No, that's Joseph. Hi, Debbie. Yes, you are a wellness champion, Tiffany. Carmen, how do you know if you have parasites and how do you get rid of them? So any of the symptoms that I was talking about, do you have chronic fatigue? Do you have things like memory issues and foggy head? Do you feel weak? Do you not sleep well? Do you wake up throughout the night? Do you have constipation, gas, bloating, right? All of stomach pain. So a lot of stomach issues, a lot of head issues. Do you have mood swings? Maybe you're feeling depressed or anxious, right? We know that a lot of the chemicals produced from parasites, they can really give us severe anxiety. And I myself, years ago, I had anxiety. There was a little period of time, but as I treated the infections, it was gone. So as you treat, you become peaceful and you become happy and you have a clear mind and you have energy. You have a lot more strength. You feel more stable, right? Because a lot of times people can start to feel like instability and then it gets worse and worse, or dizziness and vertigo. So these little microbes, these little parasites, they can be in the inner ear, they can be back, they can infect our eyes, big worms, small worms, different types of parasites. And then things like air hunger, just not being able to, walk well, or trying to walk up a hill and you're just like overly exhausted. For women, I notice a lot of women, they come and they join the program and they really think that they're going through menopause, or they are going through menopause and they swear that their night sweats, etc., are all, the flushes they're getting is all caused by menopause. And for the vast majority of women, I'm seeing that it is just infection. So what we do is we correct nutritional deficiencies, we support the body. So with the Academy is that we stop feeding the infections and we support the body with lots of nutrition and with lots of other things as far as building you up first, then treating the infections. And then women find that they no longer have mood swings, they no longer have the sweats during the day or at night, especially at night. And they're like, oh, I guess it wasn't menopause. I went through menopause with no symptoms. That's how you're supposed to go through menopause. It's like, oh, I guess it's done, right? And that's, so we have a lot of menopause symptoms, but that isn't what we should have. That is a sign that we are really out of balance. And yes, it could be nutritional deficiencies. And yes, we have to use a holistic approach. We have to decrease the toxins, right? We have lots and lots of toxins from many things in our environment. But the biggest cause, right, of why we feel so sick is infections. And the biggest part of infections, I have come to learn personally and working with hundreds of wellness champions, it is largely parasites that are causing the problem. So again, you know, when we're feeling like we're having hormonal issues or menopause, think about infections, think about parasites first. When you're having all of the head things going on, whether it's mood, whether it's fatigue, whether it's brain fog, think about parasites. When you're just feeling less energy, or you're not sleeping well at night, or you've got stomach pain. So it's, you know, and even like I mentioned with swallowing, it's ridiculous how wide the scope is of symptoms. So it is infection, and largely it is parasites. So parasites, large and small, will, and that includes fungus, they will perpetuate bacterial infections, and they will cause us to be more susceptible to viruses also. Hi, Diane and Tammy. All right, I'll see if there's any last questions. So thank you, Danielle. So if you're at a place where it's like, oh my gosh, Pam, I think you're showing me that there is an answer to my problems, please watch my videos. I've got a ton of videos on YouTube, and they will make a difference. If you go through what I share, you implement, you are going to start feeling better. But there is going to come a point in time where you have to work with someone. You have to treat the infections. That's what's going to bring you the greatest and the highest quality of life, where you live your best life, where you have that extra energy and you can really do the things you're passionate about. If that's the case, if you're at that place, it's like, Pam, I want a plan. I don't want to figure this out myself. Reach out to us, watch our masterclass training, and then you'll be able to chat with myself and you'll be able to get started right away. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. Next week, I won't be here because I'm going to be at this amazing workshop, and I will have many wonderful insights to give back to you from an incredible hero doctor who is actually an expert at treating parasites. And a lot of the insights that we've gained from him. So I'll be there. And the following week, we're going to talk about biofilms, because that is something that really keeps us sick. And we have to understand what they are and how we deal with them, and how we make sure we don't have a Herx reaction by, you know, dealing with them properly. So with that, I'm just going to check if there's any last questions. I think that is it. One last check. Oh, Roberta, will Mimosa pudica treat some parasites in the intestines? Yes. So some of the common types of herbs would be wormwood and cloves and black walnut and Mimosa pudica, but you have to be careful with Mimosa pudica. You have to know how to use it. You can't use it for long periods of time. Same thing with wormwood. So that's why you need to work with somebody. But with chronic disease, we found that Mimosa pudica on its own is, and even the cloves and the black walnut and the wormwood is just not treating the infections well enough. People are getting some symptom improvement, but it's not really getting into the blood. It's not getting into the central nervous system. It's more localized in the GI tract. And we're not using strong enough doses to kill the really big worms that actually are a really big part of what, for most of us, many of us, is what is bringing us to chronic disease. Because remember, they're depositing a lot of waste in us. And when I say infested, like some of my students, I would say the student that, all my students are my heroes, but this student has passed several hundred worms, all right, several hundred worms. And that is using antiparasitic drugs plus herbs, but having to go really slowly because she's so infested. So when I'm talking about when you have chronic disease, you're infested with worms, maybe you don't have several hundred big ones, but you probably have many, many small ones and big ones combined. So that is the key, is that things like Mimosa pudica can be helpful, but it is not going to be enough to, in our opinion, from what we've seen, it's not enough to help people to really recover from chronic disease. H. pylori is considered a parasite or a bacteria. It is a bacteria, but when I talk about the acid, the stomach acid, the GERD can be caused by fungus, which is a parasite. And so this whole bacteria, like this is where, if it's kind of living off of us, anything that's living off of you is kind of a parasite. So this can kind of fall into both categories. But again, it's something that you would treat, but when you increase your stomach acid, you won't have it in the future. So we don't want to block the stomach acid, but again, work with your practitioner. Everything I share is for educational purposes only. And would milk thistle help, Caroline? So, or Carolyn, milk thistle is really great to support your liver, but it is not going to treat any types of parasites for sure. But it is good to support your liver because there's many different toxins that we're getting in from the environment for sure. You are so very welcome, Rochelle. Let's see if there's any last. Hi, David. Is there someone in Vancouver, BC to work with? I'm located in British Columbia, so you're more than welcome to look me up. We are building a network of practitioners, so I don't have any names here right now. Elvira, and honestly, the problem is that there is somebody in the Northwest in the United States, Klinghardt Academy. You could go there, and this is Dr. Klinghardt. He's trained up different practitioners there. But the problem is that when you go to the clinic, you're going to spend approximately $30,000 or more in first testing and treating infections. So this gets to be really costly for people. So that's what you have to be careful. Number one, you've got to work with somebody who's knowledgeable, but these really wonderful clinics, and then there's another one in Arizona that I really think they're great, but they're $40,000 to $80,000. So my recommendation is learn this yourself, do most of the work yourself. It's much more cost effective. And then you know how to manage them, how to keep the parasites down for the rest of your life. You will once a year, once you learn about this, you will definitely treat parasites once a year, do a deworming, etc., and knocking back fungus for sure. That is prevention, but to get there, you've got to do some hard work, doing the right steps. Hi, Elvira. I think that's all for the, yes, Linda, happy Easter. It is Easter this weekend coming up. Hi, Marlene. All right, I think that's most of the questions. Okay, I'm gonna let you guys go. So again, next week, there is no Facebook Live. The following week, we will be talking about biofilms and why they are so important to deal with and how to deal with them safely. So until then, we'll see you later. Take care and bye-bye for now.